We are hosting today Michelle Lochner, who is working at the Western Cape University in South Africa. And she will tell us about anomaly detection in astronomical data using machine learning. So we don't have a completely fixed schedule, I mean, for the seminars. Of course, after, if you want to speak for one hour and a half, maybe some people will have to leave, but...
I promise I won't speak for that long.
Okay, so please go ahead, and I'm sure that some more people will arrive.
Sure. Well, thanks, Benoit. Thank you so much for inviting me. Let me start by showing my screen. All right, so I hope you can all see that. So yeah, it's really great to be here and talking to you all about anomaly detection in astronomy. So as Benoit said, I'm Michelle Lochner. I'm a senior lecturer at University of the Western Cape in South Africa. I also have a joint appointment with the South African Radioastronomy Observatory, so you will see some pretty radio pictures a bit later in the talk. I normally aim this talk at a relatively general audience who's a bit new to machine learning. I was pleased to hear that most of you are probably pretty familiar with machine learning, so I'll try to skip over those bits and focus a little bit more on the gory details. But if it's a bit light on gory details, just feel free to ask me some questions, some technical questions at the end. Okay, so I'll start by setting the stage talking about the two telescopes that I'm involved in and very excited about that I think are representing exciting data challenges in astronomy. There we go. So the first is the Vera C. Rubin Observatory. So this is an optical telescope under construction in Chile, and it's going to conduct what you may have heard of as the Legacy Survey of Space and Time, or LSST. And this is a really cool telescope because it seems to be able to do basically everything. It's a very big telescope, it's 8.4 meters, but it's also got a big field of view, it's very deep, it's very fast. So it will make kind of a movie of a good chunk of the southern sky every 3 nights. So here's a simulation where every single dot is a newly discovered supernova. And if you think back that the dark energy discovery was made with just 42 supernovae, we're expecting around 500,000 really well sampled supernovae by the end of this survey. So in terms of doing transformative science, the Rubin Observatory is really exciting. And it also represents these incredible data challenges. So I talked about well-measured supernovae, but every single night, Rubin Observatory is going to detect 10 million things changing on the sky every night. So it's going to issue 10 million alerts a night. And about half of those are going to be, satellites. A lot of them will be satellites and cosmic rays and things like that. But even if only a fraction of them are real, interesting astrophysical objects, this is an enormous data rate that we have to figure out how to deal with. So the field of optical transients is very active in terms of machine learning because we recognized quite a while ago that there's simply not enough grad students in the world to go through 10 million alerts every night. On the other side of the spectrum is the Square Kilometer Array that I'm sure you're all very familiar with. This will be the biggest radio telescope ever built, and it's under construction. So construction has just recently started with part of the telescope in South Africa, the Mid-Frequency Array, and part of the telescope in Australia. And the raw data rates from the SKA are nothing short of stupid. It's a monumental amount of data. But even the processed data, once it's made it through all the preliminary processing, once you've run your cleaning algorithms, etc., we're talking about source catalogs of over 1 billion galaxies. We're talking about it's not going to detect quite as many transients as the Rubin Observatory, but it will be hundreds of thousands of transients. And then in terms of pulsars, we're back up to enormous numbers again. And we're kind of already facing this transition to this enormous data regime with the telescopes that we have in place on the ground right now taking data. Of course, the one very close to my heart is Meerkat, which is situated in South Africa, in Karoo, which is a 64-dish telescope. these are astronomers who are used to being able to download data to their laptop and, play with it and analyze it. And now you're getting data sets easily a terabyte big. So we're very quickly transitioning to different ways of working with this data. Of course, we have ASCAP in Australia, very complementary, beautiful telescope doing these enormous surveys. And we have LOFAR in Europe, which is doing similar things, but in the low frequency regime. And these are producing beautiful and very large data sets. So we're facing this data explosion. This is kind of how I feel about it. It's a lot to deal with, but it's also very exciting opportunities for discovery. Okay, so this is usually where I do an introduction to machine learning, which it sounds like I don't need to do. But I do want to just highlight the differences between supervised machine learning, which is very commonly used, and unsupervised learning, which is perhaps less commonly used, although it's becoming quite a hot topic. So supervised machine learning, a typical example would be a classification problem where we have two different classes, the circles and the crosses. And for any new object that comes in, we're trying to be able to predict which class it should belong to. So our algorithm should be able to learn a model that can divide these two classes. So basically automatically learning a model to map inputs to outputs using a training set. That's the kind of supervised part. Again, probably don't need to go through this for this crowd, but I like to use this example of the simplest neural network that I could think of. And I like to, this is actually an exercise I get my students to do when I teach machine learning, just to kind of demystify it a little bit, that you can actually write down the equation of this output given some inputs, given an architecture of a network. And even for these very complicated models that we have, this equation may get very complicated, but the point is that it is simply a model that we are trying to automatically learn. So just to situate ourselves in terms of definitions for the rest of the talk. So all of machine learning always starts with some data. It's very much a data-driven field. That's where we focus. Now, a key question is what you do with that data. So in the case of pretty traditional machine learning, we need to do some kind of feature extraction. Usually the data is too complex, too high dimensional, and not in the correct form to be able to solve whatever problem we're trying to solve. And this feature extraction step is typically the most important, in my opinion, for any machine learning problem, because it's really easy to choose features that actually have nothing to do with the problem you're trying to solve. I mean, if you're trying to distinguish between cats and dogs, does it have fur is not a very useful feature. So, and this will become very important when I talk about anomaly detection, because your choice of feature extraction is going to dictate what types of anomalies you are sensitive to. And of course, this is the allure of deep learning, where we can effectively automate this step and do the feature extraction at the same time as solving whatever task we want to solve. The other distinction is to think about whether you have labeled or unlabeled data. Of course, in the labeled regime, you're now talking about supervised learning, where you could have classification or regression. But I'm mostly going to be focusing on the unsupervised learning step, where you actually don't have any training data. You simply have a large data set that you want to do science with, which is quite a fun regime to be in. And there, you could probably, there's two kind of main activities that you could do in the unsupervised branch. There's clustering, where you try to automatically learn if there are classes or at least similar types of objects in your data set. And then there's anomaly detection, which I'm going to talk about at length. Okay, just before I get into the unsupervised stuff, I just wanted to talk a little bit, well, show one example of a supervised learning problem that I've been working on for some years, which is supernova classification. So this is a very important problem in the optical transient astronomy field. So if you're not super familiar with supernovae, basically, to a cosmologist anyway, like myself, my background is cosmology, there are essentially two types of supernovae. There's the type 1As, which are useful as standard candles for constraining dark energy, etc. And then there's basically everything else. Of course, if you're interested in supernovae, you probably care about all the different classes in the everything else category. but to cosmologists, this is more or less the classification. And the Rubin Observatory is going to detect millions of these things, but the problem is Rubin is photometric only. So we basically can take images in different colors, that's it. And the only way to really type a supernova accurately is with a spectrum. We only expect spectroscopic follow-up for a small fraction of our data set, so that means we are stuck with the photometry, and we are stuck with basically guessing at the class of the supernova from the photometry alone. And that's where machine learning comes in. So this is a problem I've been working on for 6 years now, actually. And so this is the kind of input data that you have. So this is a typical light curve. We have the brightness of the supernova as a function of time, and we'll usually have this in different colors and different filters. So you can see that there are some deviations between the filters. So given this input data, we needed to design some kind of machine learning algorithm to be able to classify, in this case, into 3 different classes of supernovae. And here I've got a TSNE plot. So those of you familiar with TSNE, is a form of embedding high dimensions into low dimensions. And what you can see is with the features that we used, we had reasonably good separation, and we did quite well with the classification step. And we explored different types of feature extraction, everything from fitting models. We have no physically based models for supernovae, they're too complex, but we have some models that are data driven, basically. So we fit some models and use those parameters as features. And we also did a very model agnostic approach using wavelets as a feature extractor, which worked really well. And in fact, in a follow-up paper, we managed to use the same technique for radio transients. So this was work we did quite early on with a set of simulations that was similar to what was expected from the dark energy survey. But fast forward a few years, and we've been working on an updated simulated data set called Plastic. This is a publicly available challenge of simulated LSST light curves. And it was really interesting because we applied all the same algorithms to this data set, expecting it to perform well, and the performance tanked completely. And then it took us quite a while to understand why and understand what we needed to improve. And I like to point this out because the problem wasn't the machine learning. Okay, we shifted to a slightly different algorithm from random forests to gradient boosted machines. We changed a little bit in the feature extraction, but not very much. But so really the actual machine learning bits didn't change very much. What ended up having the biggest impact on performance was the data itself and how we processed it. So this data set was much more messy, it was much more gappy than this previous data set that was very beautiful, and the light curves are very well constrained. So we had to develop a new approach using Gaussian processes. We had to do a new augmentation approach because the training set was very non-representative of the test set. So we had to do quite a lot of stuff to the data in order to eventually match our previous performance. And this has been sort of a common theme with my experience with machine learning. Often the difficulty lies not in the machine learning part, but in the actual data, in the training data. It can have massive impact on the algorithms. Okay, so that was just sort of a side note about supervised learning. So now I'm going to stick with, for the rest of the talk, with anomaly detection, which is what's been my main field of interest for the last couple of years. Okay, so I think when I say anomaly detection, I think everybody has a very intrinsic understanding of what an anomaly is. It's anything that's weird, anything that's very different from the norm. And we can kind of talk about 2 different types of anomalies. There's the kind of known unknowns, which are simply rare events, right? So you might also consider those just to be outliers. So these are things that we are expecting, that we can even look for, but are still very rare in the data set. So for instance, strong lenses are very rare, gravitational waves, fast radio bursts, although perhaps less rare than we previously thought. These are all examples of things that we have seen before, but they are so rare, it can be difficult to build big enough training sets to actively go and look for them. In fact, things that hunt for strong lenses, for instance, are invariably built on simulations because we just don't have enough examples to train the CNN. But of course, the thing that's really exciting to us as scientists are the unknown unknowns. So the things that we aren't looking for, that we aren't expecting, the real true scientific discoveries. And the example that I like to use is the 1967 discovery of the pulsar by Jocelyn Bell Burnell. And I like to take this example because what it took to make this amazing discovery was a very bright grad student carefully looking through her data and noticing something strange. And the question that has been on my mind for a while is, how are we going to make these scientific discoveries that up until now have relied on humans when there's 10 million alerts every night? When there's a billion galaxies in your data set? When previously we've relied on humans, the human intuition and ingenuity to make these discoveries, how can we actually automate this process? So there are a number of machine learning algorithms used for anomaly detection. You can kind of think of them as, because they are untrained. When I think of anomaly detection, I'm inevitably thinking of the case where you are trying to be sensitive to new things. So by definition, it cannot be a supervised learning problem. So these algorithms will run on a data set and will usually try to look for, or try to learn kind of what the majority looks like, so that anything far away by some measure of far away will be given a higher anomaly score. So a couple of examples that you may or may not be familiar with. The one is isolation forest, which is built on the very popular random forest algorithm, which basically tries to apply a series of cuts to isolate each point on its own. And you can see that if a point is kind of buried in amongst all of these other points, it will be very difficult to isolate. Whereas if it's on the edge, far away from them, it's easy to isolate. So basically where it ends up on the tree is a measure of its anomalyness. There's also a local outlier factor, which is very commonly used, and it's basically just a density-based algorithm looking for points in low-density regimes. As always with machine learning, which algorithm works best very much depends on your data and your problem at hand. We've also worked on a number of novel anomaly detection algorithms. I'm particularly fond of BADAC, that's the Bayesian anomaly detection and classification algorithm. This is a very nice algorithm because it's fully Bayesian. So unlike most machine learning algorithms, it can very naturally incorporate uncertainties. And I think this is quite important going forward, where a lot of the objects that we detect are going to be relatively low signal to noise. So you're going to just get a massive amount of false positives unless you can actually deal with the uncertainty in the data. So if you want to, you can read that paper about BADAC. Another algorithm, well, it's really a kind of a framework developed by colleagues of mine. It's called DRAMA, which is a deep learning based anomaly detection approach that tries to learn and I mean, this is an approach that's becoming very popular these days, where you try to learn a latent space using deep learning and then do the anomaly detection in that latent space. But when my colleague, Bruce Bassett, and I started talking about this a couple of years ago, we quickly realized that just anomaly detection alone isn't actually enough, because something might be an anomaly, but that doesn't mean it's scientifically interesting. So for example, I've got some images here which are artifacts, and most algorithms would pick these out as anomalous, but I might not care about artifacts, but I might care about real sources. But what we realize is there's an inherent subjectiveness to this. Unlike where we might all be able to agree on the difference between a spiral and an elliptical galaxy, whether an anomaly is interesting to you depends on your interests. So you might really care about data quality, in which case the anomalies you're most interested in are the artifacts, so that you can learn about them and constrain them. Even within real sources, I might be particularly interested in tidal tails, but I don't care about whatever strong lenses or weirdly colored galaxies or things like that. So we needed an approach that could handle this, because in the scale, when you've got 10 million alerts a night, a lot of things are going to be anomalies. There's still going to be a large number of things that might be interesting. So we still need an extra level of filters. Okay, so this is where active learning plays a role. And active learning is where you combine the raw processing power of machine learning with the intuition and expertise of a human. And the goal is always to use the human time as intelligently as possible. So we don't want a human to sit and try and label 100,000 boring objects selected randomly from a data set. That's not very useful. We want to try and use human time to very quickly find interesting anomalies in this data set. So our approach to this was a framework that we developed called Astronomical. Very proud of the name, although it's a bit of a mouthful. And this is publicly available on GitHub. You're welcome to give it a try, and the paper is linked to there. So the way Astronomical works is it's a framework that's built on Python and also JavaScript. So the first part is a fairly standard machine learning pipeline where you read in your data, and Astronomical is designed to be able to handle a wide variety of astronomical data, from optical images, radio images, whatever type of image you want, time series data, spectra, just sets of features you might have lying around. Whatever kind of data you have, it should be able to work with it. Then, as I said before, the key step is feature extraction. And there's a variety of different feature extractors in Astronomy, including we're introducing some deep learning based feature extractors, actually, which I'll talk about right at the very end. But there's also some more kind of traditional ones. And once you've extracted your features from your data, the rest of the pipeline really doesn't care what your original data looked like, right? It can just run machine learning on these features. So we have a series of anomaly detection algorithms you can choose from. But the really important part is this loop here. So in order to do the active learning, I built a JavaScript web interface, which you can run just on your computer or you can run remotely. And with this, you can go through your data and it will sort it from most to least anomalous according to the anomaly detection algorithm. And you can label it. And the way we chose to do the labeling is not a binary yes or no, but just how interesting is this object. So it can learn which regions of feature space are of interest to you as a human. And the way it does the improved detection, and I can go into more of the details if anyone's interested, but it actually runs a second layer of machine learning, and then we come up with a novel way of combining these scores. One key thing to note is that if an anomaly appears, which has never been, is very different from anything that has ever been seen by the human, it's going to be prioritized. So you're not going to lose things that you might be interested in, but you haven't seen before. It's just basically ends up downweighting the things you are not interested in. Okay, so let's see it in action. So this is with a data set from Galaxy Zoo, which is a citizen science project, which is a very nice, large training set of labeled galaxies. And what I'm doing here is I'm showing you that what the interface looks like, where I just grab a random sample of galaxies, and you can see most of them are kind of elliptical. There's some spirals, but fairly ordinary looking galaxies. I then run the anomaly detection. In this case, I think it was iForest. And it orders the data from most to least anomalous. And you can see that it does a reasonably good job. Oh, I should have mentioned, in this case, the feature extractor I'm using is one that I developed, which is just based on fairly simple morphological features. So it does a pretty good job, but you can see there's still some artifacts in there. And you'll see that the numbers at the bottom are changing. That's because I'm giving this a score based on how interesting I think this object is to me. I then can run the active learning and order it by the retrained score. And what you can see is it does a reasonably good job at getting rid of the artifacts and keeping in things that could be mergers or interacting galaxies or things with interesting morphology. So just to kind of summarize those results, you can see this is a random sample of 12 galaxies. Here's the top 12 anomalies according to the machine learning. And then here's the top 12 anomalies after running active learning, but these are specifically the first 12 that I haven't seen. So if you've ever watched like Netflix or one of these streaming services and it says, oh, you might be interested in this movie or this whatever, it's a little bit like that. It's like a recommendation engine. So these are galaxies that I haven't seen before, but it thinks that I should be interested in. Okay, so the problem with the Galaxy Zoo example is we, by definition, have no ground truth because, you know, again, there's a subjectiveness as to whether something is an interesting anomaly or not. So we built a synthetic data set to test out our active learning approach because it is quite different from the way people standardly do active learning. And the synthetic data set kind of looks a bit like transient data, but it's not. It's not meant to represent anything real. These are simply drawn from mathematical functions. One class, which is this blob over here, this is, I think, a TSNE plot. This blob over here belongs to a class where everything is a different type of sine wave. And this blob over here, where everything is a parabola. And 99% of the data consisted of these two classes. The remaining 1% was split between 3 different classes of anomaly. One's a step function, this is a sum of sine waves, and this is a Gaussian. So I pretended to try and test my active learning that this was the class I was really interested in. This one I was kind of ambivalent about. I was relatively interested in it. And this one I pretended I was not interested in at all. And so again, you've got exactly the same interface, but now showing you the transient data. So if you draw a random sample, again, you're seeing mostly those 2 dominant classes, the sine wave and the parabola. If you run the machine learning, in this case it was LOF, it does a great job at when you order from most to least anomalous. So basically everything you see is an anomaly, but a lot of them are of that class that I said I wasn't interested in, that Gaussian. So again, here I'm pushing buttons to label these things. I think I only labeled about, so the data set was about 50,000. I think I only labeled around 50 to 100. So you don't have to do a lot of labels. With this interface, it takes maybe a minute or 2 to label that many objects. And then you can run the active learning. And what you'll immediately see is all those Gaussians have disappeared. They've been pushed down to the back of the queue. And I'm starting to see those sum of sine waves, which are the objects that I'm really interested in. So you really can think of it as a way of down-weighting things, anomalies that are not of interest to you, to make it more likely to find things you are interested in. Just to visualize what this looks like, so this is actually, again, a TSNE plot, but now instead of plotting points, I'm just plotting colors according to the anomaly score. And what you can see here, these numbers are the labels that I've given. So everything in this region, I've given a label of 5. It's very interesting. Everything around here, I've given 0. And everything here, I've given a 3. So you can see that before running any active learning, the anomaly detection algorithm thinks this region is very interesting. But after running it, it downweights it a lot. And now it's focusing more on this region and this region. And I should point out again that if something popped up over here, which is very anomalous, there's no training data nearby, so there's kind of an uncertainty term in the active learning. So that will automatically have quite a high anomaly score. And finally, I really have to show an example. Well, not finally, I have more examples, but I have to show an example with some Meerkat data. So this is data from the Meerkat Galaxy Cluster Legacy Survey. So this came out last year, publicly available as well. And these are a random sample of sources as detected using a source finding algorithm. And I've cut out a specific size around each source, and I'm just showing this random sample. And then what's interesting is I actually ended up using exactly the same algorithm as I did for the optical data because they were just morphological features. It worked surprisingly well for the radio data. So you can see that it's doing a good job picking out things that aren't point sources. They have some interesting morphology. And even among these, I could train it a little bit more so that I'm seeing more of the things that are interacting with the IGM and less of the sort of boring FR1s and FR2s. if you wanted to do that. Okay, so this is work kind of in prep. And here's just a snapshot of, I think, the top 10 anomalous objects in that data set. So this is another project that's ongoing with a student of mine, which was simply to apply the same algorithm to decals, which is a very large optical survey. It was once again a similar situation where we realized that the decals data, because the Galaxy Zoo data was so beautifully curated and it was very nicely selected, and every object was very well resolved, etc., not very noisy. And when we tried to run this on the actual decals data, there were a lot of steps in the actual feature extraction process that just kind of fell down. So Verlon, my student who's now starting a PhD with me, has been hard at work adapting the pre-processing steps to work with more realistic, well, real, not that Galaxy Zoo is not real, but a more general sample of optical galaxies. And these are the top 10 anomalies, so you can see it's doing a reasonably good job. And then I've also had a student who's now finished with me, Malema Ramanai, and he was focusing on giving Astronomaly the ability to work with transient data, which we have done in a previous project I'll show you in a minute. And he was also applying it to the Catalina real-time transient survey and also to simulated plastic data. And our conclusion here was that the feature extractor that we were using, which has been used here and there, but is maybe starting to fall out of favor. And we can see why, because it wasn't really great for anomaly detection, but he did find a few interesting objects, things like flare stars and carbon stars, weirdly behaving variables, etc. Okay, so the other example I wanted to, oh, sorry about that, just a phone call. Sorry. Okay, so the other example with transients that I want to show you, so this is actually some early work when Astronomaly was in a sort of early version, but it was one of the first applications of Astronomaly, and that was with the Deeper, Wider, Faster survey. So this is a survey looking for fast transients, and I'm talking about sort of on the minute time scale. And it's a multi-wavelength survey, so they have these observing runs with multiple telescopes around the world. And this was specifically the optical data, and this was a project run by Sarah Webb, who's now a postdoc in Swinburne. And she basically came to me with, I don't know, I think around 80,000 light curves that nobody had ever looked at. So I thought this was a perfect example for unsupervised learning, where it would be just a nightmare to try and mine this data without using some machine learning techniques. So what we first did was used a feature extractor called FEATS, which was actually the one we used here. But in this case, I think it worked okay because most of the objects discovered were types of variable stars, which is what FEATS was built for. So anyway, so she ran this feature extractor and we did some clustering. As you can see from this TSNE plot, the feature space was relatively well clustered. Most of these were just sources that weren't actually varying. But there were a few clear clusters of objects that she could then very quickly go look at a few examples and say, ah, yes, everything in this cluster is a variable star, everything in this cluster is a whatever. And then on the kind of remaining unclustered objects, we ran Astronomaly. And it was nice. So detected a few known variable stars, discovered a few new variable stars, discovered this ultra-fast flare, which was apparently quite unusual. So it's just a nice example of how you can take a data set that you know very little about, maybe other than some of the physics behind it. You don't have any training data, and you can pretty quickly get to some useful science by applying unsupervised learning techniques. Of course, this was all done with samples of light curves, where you've got a large existing data set that you're trying to mine for interesting objects. But when it comes to transients, that's not really what you want to do, right? Because by the time you've detected an unusual transient in that way, it's now gone, and you can't do any kind of follow-up, you can't get a spectrum, you can't learn anything more about it. So we need to be able to do anomaly detection in real time, especially for the Rubin Observatory. And this is a pretty hard problem. So when I started working on this with a student, well, he's a postdoc now at MIT, Dan Mutakrishna, the idea I had was pretty simple. I figured we know about a few classes of transients. We know about supernovae, et cetera. We even have quite a good sample of training data for some of them. What if we trained an algorithm that could model each of these individual classes, and then if we detect something which differed from the expectation of the model, that could be an anomaly. So Dan already had a classifier called Rapid that he was able to adapt and then completely threw away for a different architecture using a TCN. So he used that as a predictor for the different light curves. So what you're seeing here is as more data gets taken, the model gets more and more confident in its predictions. And it actually did really well in terms of being a predictor, but in fact, it did a bit too well. And this was an interesting example of where deep learning failed. And it turned out that a more traditional Bayesian approach based on a parametric model was actually much better for this problem. So these plots are a little bit complicated, but what we actually want to see is everything in the known class, which is on the left here, should be blue, because given a similar an object of that class, we should be able to predict it well. But anything of the anomaly classes should be red, because we should be unable to predict it. But except for a few cases, that's just not true. The deep neural net was actually able to predict basically anything, because it was learning relatively simple correlations between the different data points. I think anyway, that's why I was doing that. Whereas a parametric approach, where the model was much more constraining, so its priors were effectively trained on the training data, but the model was fairly constraining. There we found that if you used the wrong class to try and model this object, it tended to flag as more anomalous. So this worked much better, but still far from perfect. So this real-time anomaly detection problem is, I think, very much an unsolved problem. It's a very, very difficult problem. And finally, I want to give an example of where deep learning did not fail and has performed extremely well, and that's in representation learning. So this is obviously a very self-supervised learning and representations is a very hot topic in deep learning at the moment, for good reason. So I think basically we're starting to see people getting tired of training their CNNs again and again and again with new data sets, and asking the questions of can't we solve this problem once and use trained CNNs as latent feature extractors, which is an idea that's been around for a long time, but I think we're starting to get better at coming up with these representations in the first place. So this is work I did with Mike Walmsley, who's a postdoc at Manchester now, and he had this very beautiful CNN trained on the Galaxy Zoo data. And the key thing here is that it was trained on a multitask classification problem. So quite a difficult classification problem. There was like 40 classes. And they were things like, so the Galaxy Zoo classification is actually done as a decision tree. So you'll have things like, is it an elliptical or is it a spiral? If it's a spiral, does it have a bar or doesn't it? Does it have a ring? Does it have, etc.? So there's like these series of questions. So the ultimate number of combinations that you can get is quite large. The number of classes is quite large. Then, given this pre-trained CNN, you can just chop off the last layer, ignore the last layer, and take the second to last layer, which is about 1,200 features. And you can use the activations of each neuron as a feature for doing something else. And Mike looked at a number of different things, including anomaly detection. And you can see that, so my original work with Astronomy was the green line, and his is the blue line. So it was an excellent anomaly detector for these types of anomalies. And it could detect some types of anomalies, like things with rings around them, that the morphology features I came up with simply couldn't do. What was interesting though is that if you visualize the feature space using UMAP, it kind of ends up looking like this big blob, not with nice clean clusters, and the anomalies actually don't really look that anomalous. So he had to come up with a different kind of approach, which was less of an anomaly detection algorithm and more of just a quick way of using active learning as a classifier effectively. So this is one of the challenges with using these kinds of representations, is that they may not actually be well suited to traditional anomaly detection, etc. So this is one of the things that I'm interested in working on, is improving these representations. Okay, so I'm actually pretty close to the end of my talk. One thing I always mention in every talk, just to keep advertising it, is the Supernova Foundation. So this is a mentoring program for women and gender minorities in physics that I'm the founder and director of. So if you identify as a woman, or you know someone who does, who might be interested in being a mentor or a mentee, please just take a look at this website. We're always looking for especially more mentors, but also mentees. And so I'll finally just conclude with, I'm pretty sure I don't need to convince anyone in this group that machine learning is critical in facing this data deluge. And in particular, we need to automate anomaly detection, because we are at risk of really missing out on important scientific discoveries. And our attempt to address this is called Astronomical, which is available there. If you do give it a try, I mean, the code is very much still in development, so please feel free to reach out to me if you need some help. And also just to mention the Supernova Foundation. So I'll stop there and take any questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michelle. So I guess we will have some questions. People can raise hands. Maybe to give them time to formulate them. I have a first question. That's actually about your last slide. Well, the last slide with scientific content, not the conclusions. This one, yes. So that's very surprising. The fact, I guess that the red dots are all the anomalies, and they and so first. In this case, I didn't catch it in the rest of the talk. I guess you're using some visualization technique that projects a feature space on 2D. And what is this? Which specific technique are you using?
So in this case, it's UMAP.
Sorry?
UMAP. It's let me try and get this. Uniform manifold something.
Okay, that's kind of similar to self-organizing maps or something like that?
No, it's a bit different. I mean, I guess you can consider them the same sort of class of technique, in that you're trying to learn a low-dimensional representation of a high-dimensional space. So they are kind of, the main ones are things like self-organizing maps, TSNE, so T-distributed stochastic neighbor embedding, which is the other plots that I showed previously, and UMAP are kind of similar in their approach, in that they try to, it's not technically a projection, it's an embedding. So they're trying to learn a new two-dimensional space such that if points are nearby in the high-dimensional space, they remain nearby in the low-dimensional space. So it's a very useful tool for visualization in particular. You can use UMAP itself as a way of actually reducing the dimensionality of your data, which is something that we've played around with. So if you've ever used things like PCA, principal components analysis, that's commonly used to reduce the dimensionality down. So UMAP would be an alternative to that on very different principles. So again, it's a case of, you know, one might be more appropriate for your data than others. But yeah, so it's a low-dimensional representation of this high-dimensional space.
In the end, my question is: do you think that the fact that the two populations are not separated is because of this low-dimensional representation, or which could be But which is more worrying is that they are not indeed separated in the feature space. and it's so. It's surprising that if you train your machine learning methods in such a way that they should be separated in the feature space, and then they are not. So do you have any?
I do. I've actually spent a lot of time thinking about this. I think it's very interesting. It also surprised me a lot. So I've dug into this quite a bit. One of the experiments that I did is I actually took ResNet, which is a very commonly used CNN architecture. I got a pre-trained ResNet algorithm. So it's been trained on ImageNet data, so ordinary pictures of houses and trees and whatever. And I did this low-dimensional representation, so I did UMAP, and I ran this this network on examples from the original training set. And there I saw beautiful separation, right? So you get nice, very clear clusters. And in cases where it confuses the classes, you just see some points on top of each other, but you still see these very clear clusters. So I wondered if part of it was simply taking this architecture and running data through it that's a bit different from the data it was originally trained on. But in this case, the data is extremely similar to the data that it was originally trained on. So this network was trained on Decal's data, and it's being run on Galaxy Zoo data, which is from SDSS. And I think you see this even if it's run on the original data set. But what's happening, I think, is that in this case, where the classes are somewhat similar to each other, an elliptical galaxy is not that different from a spiral galaxy. I think there's no incentive for the algorithm to learn features that pulls the classes apart very distinctly. Because remember, it is solving a very difficult classification problem. It's not a clean binary one. There's a lot of different classes, and there's a lot of overlap, visual overlap between the classes. So remember, the final layer of a CNN is always a fully connected layer, which has to actually learn what the boundaries are in this feature space in order to separate the classes. And the thing is, these algorithms are super flexible, right? There is no reason it can't learn this very delicate, complicated line through this feature space to separate out this class from this other class. So it can still get very accurate results without any kind of incentive to push the features apart into these different clusters. So I'm still experimenting with it, trying different architectures, but that's my current hypothesis. It's got a lot to do with the architecture you choose and the type of problem that the algorithm is originally having to solve. And I think this is really important, because if we're going to be using these representations for different problems, we better make sure that they are actually good representations. So I think it's definitely something I'm continuing to experiment with. I have seen this type of behavior with a few other architectures that I've tried as well. So it's not just this architecture and this particular problem. It seems to be fairly common.
Okay, thank you. So some other questions?
Yes, I had one, if I may.
Sure, go ahead.
So I was wondering, on your recommendation engine, you show that the user is asked to rate the interest of the object on a scale of 1 to 5, but that is something that is really subjective. So do you have ways to normalize feedback from different users? Because you cited, for example, what is made with Galaxy Zoo, where there are clear criteria that the user can follow to tag the source. So what is your approach to this problem?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So, okay, there's a couple of things. The first thing to keep in mind is that Astronomy, although I have the long-term vision of it being used by many people, in the interim, it's really for you to use on your data in whatever way is useful to you. So if you are looking for specific types of galaxies, or you're looking through your data and you find something interesting and you want to find more of them, then it doesn't matter. I mean, by definition, it must be subjective because it's what you want to find. However, if you want to do something a little bit more scientific than that and actually build populations out of these things that people are finding, you are going to have to normalize it and find some way of kind of standardizing multiple input. So like one of the things that we want to do is put this on the Rubin science platform, which some aspect of it will be available for citizen science projects. So you might have like 100 different people looking at the same object and saying whether or not it's an anomaly. And in fact, they already had this in Galaxy Zoo, where they did have an option where you could say, is there anything odd about this object? And we've had quite a few conversations. So in the citizen science context, it's actually very difficult to get users to reliably detect things that are strange without giving them like clear guidelines the way Galaxy Zoo currently does. So I think for the average user, I mean, it's just better to kind of crowdsource it as the possibility of finding anything interesting rather than trying to build like robust classifications, for instance. It's really designed for discovery rather than saying, okay, we are 87% sure that this is an anomaly, because it is so subjective. I think the general citizen, it's not clear in my mind how you easily combine that information other than just for discovery. When it comes to actual scientists, though, we do have a bit of a better idea of what we're looking for and what we find interesting. But even among scientists, there's not a lot of consensus for classification problems. So yeah, this is a very long, rambling answer to your question. To summarize, it is subjective. It's meant to be subjective. It's okay if it's just you using it. If you want to start combining user input, you need to do it it's a non-trivial problem. You need to do it in a way that's intelligent and is going to help achieve whatever scientific goals that you want to achieve. I will also point out one final thing, particularly with the representation learning. What this feature space is really good at is identifying similar objects. So if you find an object in feature space and you want more examples that are similar to that, these features are much better than anything I've used at being able to do that. And I think that's a very useful use case. You've got someone, you could crowdsource this anomaly detection, and then you have like these sets of possible anomalies, and then you can look at it and you can say, oh, find me more like that one. But I think the whole point is that it is active and it does require this human in the loop, and it's always going to require that human in the loop. So yeah, again, rambling answer, sorry.
Yeah, that was very clear. It's not a, there are a lot of different things that we can do with that, and it's very interesting. Exactly. Thank you.
Thanks. I think there's a hand up.
Rodrigo?
Yes. Thank you very much. Oh, thank you very much, Michelle. Very interesting. So I guess just sort of following on from David's question, is it really the case that there's no sort of general information theory type? I mean, is it actually always the case that one has to put in one's priors, or isn't there some sort of I guess a complexity type argument that one could apply to data in general, right? Because I guess it's all about mappings at some level, right? And you can always imagine, I suppose, a whole bunch of simple mappings that whereby your data are kind of clustered and other ones are far away. And of course, you can imagine some complicated mappings where even the stuff that's far away goes into the middle, whatever, right? But I just wondered, is it hopeless to try and look for something that's completely automated?
That's a really interesting point. Like there's a couple of things in there. So first of all, in terms of like an information theory perspective, absolutely. For instance, a very simple thing you can do is run PCA, so principal component analysis, on a data set, and then just look for things that are badly reconstructed by your principal components. I mean, you will find anomalies. You can do, so there's a team in Australia actually looking with this with ASCAP, where specifically they look at complexity. And this was inspired by things like compression algorithms in images. So for instance, to make a JPEG, it uses a wavelet basis set. And you can actually measure how simple the image is or how complex it is simply by the size of it, like how many wavelets does it need to reconstruct it. There are things like people using GANs, generative adversarial networks, and looking for things that are badly reconstructed there. So there are actually a lot of different approaches you can do, which hinge on the idea that something that is different from the norm will be difficult to represent with some sort of low dimensional basis set. So that gets you the anomalies. And many other things get you the anomalies. Isolation forest, which works on a totally different principle, but will also find things that are different. LOF will find things that are different. My experience is that it's not that hard to find the anomalies. What's hard is to then group them together in some way, because that's where we're needing to get to. Because if you've got a, like I've been working with some meerkat data, and there might be 6,000 sources in an image, and maybe 20 of them are truly interesting. That's easy, right? Those are small numbers. You can deal with that. Even if a bunch of those are artifacts, you can deal with that. But when we're talking about 1 billion galaxies or 10 million transients, even like a 1% of the data set being anomalies is still overwhelming. So I'm looking at these unsupervised techniques and combining active learning. I find it ironic that when you combine active learning with unsupervised techniques, to my mind, that is supervision. But anyway, so I'm doing supervised, unsupervised learning. So trying to develop these techniques that you have to bring in the human at some point, but to minimize the amount that you need the human in there. So really the hard step, I think, is after the anomaly detection, because there's simply no way an algorithm can automatically know which class of anomalies is actually going to be of interest to you until you give it some kind of training, and trying to do the training as painlessly as possible.
Yeah, I guess that makes sense, because at some level you need to know what the human thinks, right, in order to be able to do that. But yeah, thank you very much.
Thanks. Good question.
Yeah, along those lines that Rodrigo was mentioning, what about using entropy as a proxy for complexity?
Yeah, I mean, as I said, like you can come from any kind of information theory perspective. I'm sure that it would be effective at finding anomalous things. But the problem is that, like if you look at, I've got some examples of some radio galaxies. So something like this, which is much more complex than a point source, will have very high complexity by whatever you want to measure complexity as. But I don't have really any examples here because the meerkat data is so clean, but you can have cases where you have these awful artifacts, which makes these big streaks across the image, which will probably also look quite complex. So yes, I'm sure you could use measures like that, and you will find the anomalies, but you will find the artifacts just as many times as you'll find the actually interesting sources.
Okay, thanks.
Maybe I have a last, a little bit technical one. I was surprised by the fact that you needed to relabel, well, not relabel, but to give the human input on such a low number of examples. So can you explain a little bit technically, maybe how it comes that such a low number is sufficient?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll use this image as an example. So what we do is, so this is again, a low dimensional representation of the feature space. Okay, so we run 2 layers of machine learning. The one is anomaly detection, which is a fully automated approach. There's no human involved there. So that's to get the raw anomaly score. Then we run a second layer of machine learning, which is just you can use anything, but it's just a simple regression that's trying to predict, as a function of feature space, what the human finds interesting. Okay, so it's almost like these 2 different layers, 2 different maps, as it were, the anomaly score and the like interestingness score. So you can visualize it here. So the color is the anomaly score. So this region is very high anomalies. This is relatively low. It's sort of mediocre. And then the numbers are the human score. Okay. And then what we also do is we actually incorporate a measure of uncertainty. So in the actual equation that we came up with, I'll show it to you in a second, we have a measure of uncertainty so that if you are far away from any training data, it kind of ends up defaulting back to the raw anomaly score. So you don't need a lot of training data because you're not trying to fill in this entire feature space. You're just trying to learn the bits that's not interesting to the user. So all it needs is a few points in this region. And you see that, like, locally in just that region of feature space, the density of training points is actually quite high because I'm telling it that anything around here I'm not interested in. So it's actually reasonably confident in this region, but in all of the rest of feature space, it's very unconfident. So that's basically the reason why you don't need a lot of training data, because you're not trying to predict over the entire feature space. You're just trying to predict locally because you can fall back on the anomaly score in regions where you are uncertain. So one of the things we're looking at extending is, at the moment, by default, it just orders the data from most anomalous to least anomalous. But what you might like to do is improve your estimate of interestingness. So, use more traditional active learning techniques to say, okay, I'll show you a few objects in these regions that I'm not sure of, just to make sure that there isn't actually something interesting there. And I'll just show you, I think at the end I put the equation. Yeah, so I think this is the equation. So basically we reweight the anomaly score by this function. And so it includes this distance penalty term, so that if the distance to the nearest label is really, really high, then essentially this whole thing just ends up tending to 1, and you just end up getting back your machine learning anomaly score. So it's just going to return, the human labeling does nothing in that region because there's not enough labels there. But if you're in a region where there's quite a few neighbors and it's quite confident in the interestingness score, then it ends up weighting the anomaly score by that interestingness score. So if you're in a region, ultimately you can think of it that you can only really downweight things. Say, I'm really, really not interested in this, so that you don't run the risk of missing out on things that might actually be interesting. Does that answer your question?
Mostly, yes. Just to be sure, when you retrain on all samples, even those that you have not relabeled. Is that true?
Well, when you train, so when I say retrain, I'm really just recalculating this predicted user score and rerunning this equation to get the new anomalies for the new anomaly scores. So this part only gets run once because it's fundamental to the data. The human has nothing to do with this part. It's only this part that the human has anything to do with. So this is my prediction of interestingness across feature space. And the more labels I add, so as I add more labels and then I run it again, this prediction gets better, but only in the regions that it's actually labeled. So when you click retrain, it reruns a machine learning algorithm to predict this, and then it just recalculates this for every point, for every object in the data set.
Okay. Oh, I think I understand more or less. Thank you.
Yeah, it is a bit technical.
Yeah, but no, that's how you, in the end, you really understand what's going on.
Exactly.
Okay, any more questions? So if not, we will thank you very much for giving this very nice talk. Unfortunately, at least one person who would have been interested is probably in vacation. I think if Stefan had been there, he would have been interested by a number of subjects, but well, he will probably be able to watch the YouTube.
I'm certainly more than happy if anyone wants to email me, ask questions, start a collaboration. Always great. That's the best outcomes for these talks.
Okay, so thank you very much, and have a good day.
You too. Thank you, everyone. It's lovely to meet you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
I